Hello, health psych students. This is part one of your cardiovascular disease lecture. Okay, so cardiovascular disease for both men and women, even though a lot of people think that breast cancer is the leading cause of death for women, for both men and women, cardiovascular disease was the leading cause of death, usually by heart attacks or stroke, pre-COVID. Okay, and we talked about in the intro lectures how COVID, coronavirus disease deaths have surpassed the previously leading cause of death. Here's my joke. I'll let you absorb the CPR of the mouse. Ha ha. All right. Now, the reason why a lot of people think that heart disease is a cause of death for men, but not necessarily women, is that women tend to get it later. Women are protected against cardiovascular disease by natural estrogen up until around the age 51 to 53 when women go through menopause. Men are having heart attacks and having strokes younger than that, and they tend to have a steady increase as they age in cardiovascular disease. Women, on the other hand, it really they're protected against it, and then at menopause, unless they've been forced into premature menopause, because of breast cancer or ovarian cancer or something where they've shut down their hormones, women really accelerate in their risk for heart attack and stroke in their early 50s. We know that in the United States, African Americans and Hispanic Americans have more cardiovascular disease than Caucasians. If you take a look down here at the CDC graph, and I know this looks like small print to me, but you'll see here is cardiovascular disease prevalence across time. And again, it's the highest up here on the chart. It is the leading cause of death. Ideally, you've watched this YouTube clip either before this recorded part one lecture or after, but just some real basic anatomy, which you exercise science majors, you've got down. You psych majors may not know the basic anatomy. And so the heart, there's a thin outer layer called the epicardium, endocardium, the thin inner layer, and then the myocardium is the heart muscle. It is the actual muscle that contracts in sync with one another that really creates the beating of the heart and creates the whole pumping of the blood. And so it's when the coronary arteries that feed the heart its blood to work as a muscle, when those arteries narrow or when those arteries clog, that is usually the classic cause of a heart attack. If there's not enough oxygen feeding blood into the heart, then heart tissue is going to die, and that's the heart attack. And we'll talk more about that later. Four chambers of the heart, the function is to bring oxygen in from the lungs and then to pump that oxygen out into the arteries, and then they go to the capillaries where they exchange material, oxygen and waste material with the cells, and then pull back from the capillaries, come back in the veins, back into the heart. And so really the heart is a way of pushing the blood all throughout our body so that our body can be fed, and then our body can remove its waste materials. Heart's the size of a fist. And then obviously the blood is carrying a bunch of stuff around in the blood vessels. Again, it goes out through the arteries, all the way to the capillaries where it exchanges, and then back through the veins. Blood pressure, let's talk a bit about blood pressure. Blood pressure is meant to be dynamic for it to be adaptive to us. And our blood pressure, the pressure in our cardiovascular system at any given time, is going to be a function of temperature, our activity. Are we sitting quietly or resting, or are we engaging in intense physical exercise? And then blood pressure has a psychological component to it where our emotions can affect our blood pressure. If we are really, really upset, if we're having a panic attack, if we are really angry at somebody, all of those things, versus if we're in this nice meditative state, or if we are petting our kitten that's purring on our lap, all of that stuff's going to affect our blood pressure. Now, I don't expect for you to know all these different things that can affect the fluid dynamics. This would be more fitting for a class, say, in exercise science than health psych. But I want you to know there was lots of different pieces, variables, if you will, to those dynamics. So how much blood we've got, are we dehydrated, are we well hydrated? How elastic are our arteries? Again, women are protected and we have nice elastic arteries up until menopause. A lot of that, the evolutionary adaptation for women is we have to carry a lot more blood volume during a pregnancy, because not only are we feeding our bodies during pregnancy, we are feeding a fetus, and that requires a lot more blood flow. So it makes sense that our arteries are capable of kind of being nice and elastic and expanding and holding more blood flow than, say, men. Do know that the American Heart Association posts what is considered to be blood pressure numbers. And the number that you see first, the systolic blood pressure, is the pressure in the arteries when the heart is contracting and the blood is forced out. The diastolic pressure is when the heart is refilling and there's not that force in that artery. So the systolic is always higher than the diastolic, but the American Heart Association has placed what they consider to be numbers. It'd be 140 over 90 that they would consider to be hypertension or high blood pressure. The normal range would be somewhere below 120 and below 80 for normal. And then there would be hypotension or low blood pressure that would happen, let's say if a person has fainted, is having a heat stroke, if the person's bleeding out and their blood pressure's too low. So really we want to maintain at a very nice normal level and have a homeostasis somewhere in here, because too high can be dangerous, too low can be dangerous. And know that blood pressure, we can't feel it. Sometimes people are a bit symptomatic, but it doesn't hurt. It doesn't hurt to have high blood pressure, which is why it's called the silent killer. When we get to pain and talk about acute and chronic pain, we're going to talk about the function of pain, that a lot of time pain notifies us that we are in danger. In this situation, there are a lot of people roaming around who are pre-hypertensive or have hypertension, and because it doesn't hurt them, they don't go get it checked, they don't go to their doctor, which is why we call it the silent killer. That it is damaging people, even if they don't know it, which is why we recommend that people get screened on a regular basis. So hypertension is high blood pressure. And again, here's how the American Heart Association quantifies what they consider to be high, what they consider to be pre-hypertensive, which nowadays we are paying a lot of attention to and we are treating, and what they consider to be normal. Know that most cases of hypertension are called primary or essential, in that they're usually lifestyle and genetically driven, but they're not secondary to a different disease. So primary meaning first. Secondary would be like, let's say you've got a tumor in your adrenal glands, and that tumor, which are called PHEOs, is spilling out all this adrenaline into your body at any given time. You would have hypertension because of that adrenal tumor secondary to the tumor. Okay, so it wouldn't be the normal kind of hypertension that people tend to have that's called primary or essential. The etiology of hypertension is multifactorial, so lots of different risk factors, including genetic ones. And one of the more infamous genetic ones for African Americans who live here in the United States, we think is because of a selection factor that occurred on slave ships once upon a time in our horrible American history, where Africans whose bodies could retain salt and could stay hydrated with limited amount of water, they were much more likely to survive and not die on a slave ship, arrive on American soil, sold as slaves, and allowed to reproduce. So the genes that created salt retention, the genes that made it easier to retain fluid, were actually adaptive genes for slave ship survival. Africans who did not have those genes were more likely not to be able to retain salt and the other electrolytes, were more likely to get dehydrated and die on the journey of the slave ships. So those genes didn't tend to get passed down in generations of African Americans who have their origins from slavery here in the United States. So that's part of the reason why we think that some individuals are more vulnerable. We know that people with obesity are more likely to have high blood pressure. Some people are sensitive to dietary salt and some people are not. But it's one of the things that doctors want us to pay attention to if we're pre-hypertensive or hypertensive. But keep in mind that most people in the United States, we only need about 500 milligrams a day. The average person in the US is over 3,000 milligrams. So most of us are getting way too much salt. The easiest way to get too much salt is to salt your food or eat a lot of processed food that is naturally salty, as well as restaurant food tends to be more salty. So home cooked meals without added salt, not sauce, is the healthiest for us. Stress can certainly create hypertension in people who are vulnerable. Cardiovascular reactivity of moods and personality. We'll talk more about that later in this lecture. And people don't get exercise. And then same thing like salt. Some people are caffeine sensitive and some people are not caffeine sensitive. But again, doctors recommending if people are vulnerable to not drink a lot of coffee or sodas that have caffeine, or especially not those high caffeine drinks, and try to cut back on their intake and see if that assists with their hypertension. That is the end of part 1.